So encounters with reality. What on earth are we talking about? Well, Buddhism tells us that our fundamental problem, as long as we're not enlightened, the basic cause of our unhappiness and our suffering, the reason we don't live lives that are full of joy and fulfillment, is that we are deluded. Our idea of reality is different from the way reality really is. And because our idea of reality is not an accurate reflection of the real nature of things, the way we live our life doesn't really work in several important ways. So there's a couple of analogies we could use for this. We could say that our idea of reality is a bit like a map. And the territory that the map represents is what's real, the real nature of things. And we use our map to navigate through life. But the Dharma tells us that our normal map is wrong in some ways that are quite important. And if our map is wrong, sometimes we're not going to get where we want to go. So we might set off for Sukhavati, the land of bliss, and end up in Barnsley. Or we might set off for the Pure Land and we end up in Sunderland. Something like that. Our normal unenlightened map of reality is just about good enough to get most of us through the basic practicalities of life. But it's wrong in some really important ways. So navigating by this map, we'll often find ourselves in dead ends or in places we really didn't want to be. And navigating with this map, we will never find real fulfillment, real deep happiness, real meaning in our lives. And another common analogy that's often used in Buddhism is it's a bit as though we were all dreaming, all asleep and dreaming. So we're living in a sort of virtual reality of our own. And in this dream, we spend our time frantically chasing after things that we really think we want, but aren't ever going to bring us real happiness. And frantically running away from things that we think are really scary, but actually can't harm us. So getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want in this dream is never going to really bring us any sort of real lasting happiness. The only solution, the Dharma tells us, ultimate solution, is to wake up. To see the real reality behind the dream, which when we see it, turns out to be far more wonderful and beautiful than we could have imagined. And of course the Buddha is someone who has completely woken up. That's what the title Buddha means. Buddha means one who is awake, one who sees the wonderful reality behind the rather grey dream that we're having. But the rest of us, we're stumbling around not seeing reality as it is, blind to the way things really are, and hence constantly falling into ditches, walking into walls, etc., etc. And we don't ever see that just over there is a fabulous, beautiful place we could all be living, the Pure Land. Enlightenment, if we would only move in that direction. So we're stumbling around in a dream, but reality is constantly trying to get through to us, trying to wake us up. Most of the time we don't want to listen, but sometimes reality sort of slaps us on the face, gives us a good talking to. We can't ignore it anymore. We have an encounter with reality, the name of our series, which gives us the opportunity to wake up, at least a little bit. Waking up, I don't think, is something that you do all at once. You do it sort of gradually. Well, I do anyway. Sometimes a bit too gradually. It happens bit by bit. So sometimes we have an encounter with reality. Sometimes reality goes, stop, gives us a shock. We're shaken out of our deluded view of things. Our eyes open up, at least a bit. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this series of Sangha Nights. We're going to be telling stories, looking at examples of people's encounters with reality, where that's happened. And we'll be asking, what was reality telling the person in this story? And therefore, what could reality be trying to tell us? if only we would listen. And of course we need to go on from that to ask, well, if reality is trying to tell us that, what does that mean practically? How can we actually change our lives so that I could change the way we act, so I could be genuinely having some success in finding happiness and fulfillment rather than walking into walls. So in a way, there is a way in which this series continues from the last one, which, for those who weren't here the last 3 months, the last series was about a sort of Buddhism that's called Tantric Buddhism, a late form of Buddhism called Tantric Buddhism. And we were exploring what that form of Buddhism could say to us, living in a very, very different environment to the one in which it developed. In Tantric Buddhism sort of developed, original Tantric Buddhism was developed in small groups of people practicing around a teacher. And the teacher was called the Guru. And we saw that Tantric Buddhism uses strong experiences and strong emotions to strip away our veil of delusion. And the Tantric Guru could be uncompromising and even merciless in doing this, in using strong experiences and strong emotions to strip away the veil. The Tantric Guru, at their best, was someone who brought their disciples face to face with reality. And Padmasambhava, for those of you who have come across it, is of course the archetype of the Tantric Guru, the sort of rather challenging teacher who challenges us to see reality as it is. But, well, okay, this idea of the uncompromising Tantric Guru who commands our complete obedience and brings us face to face with reality, this is not something which transplants well from medieval India to the modern West, really. We've seen it over and over again, haven't we? It gets too easily abused. People give up their sort of responsibility to themselves for their guru. It can be quite harmful. We don't do gurus in Triratna. But we can still have a Tantric Guru in a wider sense, because reality itself can be our Tantric Guru. Reality itself can use strong emotions, strong experiences to strip away the veils of our delusion and bring us face to face with reality. So it's in that sense that we're using the phrase Tantric Guru, that wider sense, hence the title, Encounters with Reality, Meeting the Tantric Guru, in the widest sense. And the Tantric Guru, in this wider sense, can take many, many forms. Reality can take many forms when it slaps us around the face and tries to wake us up. It can do that through a person, especially a person who is much more in touch with reality than we are. And the Tantric Guru, par excellence, of course, was the historical Buddha. He was so in touch with reality that he was reality, in a sense. And over again in the early records of the Buddha's life, we see that people had these encounters with the Buddha, these encounters with reality, which opened their eyes, stripped away their veil of delusion, at least a bit, brought them face to face with reality. So over and over again people would say things like, it's as though a bright lamp has been brought into a dark room. In other words, now I can see what's really there. And it's as though what was upside down has now been turned upright. Or we could translate that as, my map was all wrong, I got it upside down and now I've got it the right way up. I've made the correction. So some of the talks in our series will be about people's encounters with reality in the form of the Buddha. Some will be about encounters with other beings, other people. But reality can also speak to us in other ways. It could speak to us through what we might call the archetypal Buddha, if you like. It's as though we've got a connection with enlightenment in the depths of ourselves, which connects with something in the depths of the universe. And through that connection, reality can speak to us. It could speak to us maybe in dreams, maybe in meditation, maybe in visionary experiences, maybe just in moments when we suddenly come to our senses and things just look really clear. Moments of inspiration. So we'll also be telling stories about that and seeing what we can learn from those occurrences. And of course, reality can also just confront us through life experience. So over the next few months, we'll be looking at examples of that as well. But over and over again, whichever way reality is sort of presenting itself to people, we'll be asking this question: what was reality telling this person? And so what would reality really like to tell us if only we'd listen? So the encounter with reality I'm going to talk about tonight involves the historical Buddha. And it's the story recorded in a text called the Sigala Sutta, the Discourse to Sigala. So Sigala is a young man, a very young man. Maybe he's still in his teens. He lives in Rajagaha, the capital of the North Indian kingdom of Magadha. And poor Sigala has had one of those major life experiences that can shock us out of our ruts and make us more open to the voice of reality. He has suffered a major bereavement. His father has died. Sigala is still a very young man. And from what the sutra tells us, we can deduce that his dying father was very, very concerned for Sigala. He felt that he was being left in a very, very vulnerable position by the father's death. We can imagine young Sigala being left behind with the responsibility for running the family business, for being the head of the household. And Sigala doesn't have a lot of experience of the world. And without his father to guide and support him, and with all this new responsibility, we can imagine Sigala feeling quite alone in the world, a bit lost, a bit vulnerable, a bit in need of protection. So very early, every morning, Sigala does something which he thinks will give him the protection he needs, make him less vulnerable. And this is something that his father asked him to do on his deathbed. Sigala's father, on his deathbed, was obviously feeling that this lad would be in danger from the world. This lad needed some protection. And the father's response to this was, on his deathbed, to ask Sigala to do a ritual of protection every morning. And what this ritual involved was going out from the town of Rajagaha every morning, probably going to a rise or a small hill, and standing there with the world spread out around him and below him, facing the setting sun. The rising sun. It's first thing in the morning. Facing the rising sun. And then bowing to the rising sun. Bowing to the rising sun. Expressing his respect, even his worship, for the rising sun and for the whole eastern quarter of the world. And after bowing to the eastern quarter, Sigala would then turn in the direction that the sun would go around in the sky, and he would bow again to the southern quarter. And then he would bow to the southern quarter, and turn to the southern quarter and bow, again expressing his respect for that whole southern quarter of the world. And then to the west, and then to the north, doing the same thing. And then, having bowed and expressed his respect, even his worship for the world in the four quarters, he would then do the very same thing to the ground beneath his feet. Somebody asked me earlier, how did he bow to the ground? I don't quite know. But he would express his respect for the ground beneath his feet and for the sky above his head. So the 6 directions. So this is something Sigala would do every morning as a ritual of protection. And then one morning he meets the Buddha. So the Buddha has been staying in a bamboo grove at a place called the Squirrels' Sanctuary, or the Squirrels' Feeding Ground, near Rajagaha. And in the morning, the Buddha puts on, as he does every morning, he puts on his robe, And he takes his bowl, his begging bowl, and he walks towards Rajagaha to beg for food. And as the Buddha's walking towards Rajagaha, he sees Sigala going through his morning ritual. So he stands and watches at a distance, and he waits until Sigala has finished his devotions. And then when Sigala has finished, he approaches the young man to talk to him. So Sigala does his devotions. He bows to the east, he bows to the south, he bows to the west, he bows to the north, he bows to the... And as he does this, maybe he's aware of a figure watching him from a distance. And then when he's finished and he's about to walk back into the city, this person approaches him. And Sigala can see that this is one of the many wandering ascetics that there were in northern India at this time, but this one seems to have something very, very special about him. This is someone with a really powerful presence. This is someone who commands respect. This is someone who Sigala is going to listen to and really take notice of. And then this obviously very kind, but maybe slightly daunting figure asks Sigala, "Why were you doing that, young householder? Why were you bowing to the east, to the south, to the west, to the north?" And Sigala, and then to the earth, and then to the sky. "Why were you doing this?" And Sigala replies, "My father, Lord, on his deathbed said to me, 'The 6 quarters, dear son, you shall worship.' And I, Lord, respecting, revering, reverencing and honouring my father, rise early in the morning and leave Rajagaha with wet clothes and wet hair, and I worship with joined hands these 6 quarters." And then the Buddha says to Sigala, that's very well. He says something like, "That's very well, but I'm afraid that on its own, that isn't really going to give you the protection that your father wanted you to have. There is a better way of respecting and honouring the 6 directions." Now, okay, at this point, I have to admit that the Sigala Sutta, the text that tells us the story of the Sigala, shows every sign of being one of those texts in the Pali Canon that has been added to by generations of monks, okay? The Pali Canon, the oldest record of the Buddha's life and his teachings, it wasn't written down until many hundreds of years after the Buddha's death. It's as close as we can get to the words of the Buddha, but it's pretty clear that in places, generations of monks have thought it would have been really good if the Buddha had said that as well. And it would have been really good if the Buddha had said this as well. Well, let's add them in, shall we? Let's add them in. That would be really good advice too. So you end up with these rather long formulaic teachings developing and being attributed to the Buddha. And this sutta looks for all the world like one of these. In what I reckon to be the earliest teachings, especially the ones that are written down earliest, the Buddha's teachings to people like Sigala are concise and pithy and memorable. You've just got to remember them. But the words attributed to the Buddha in this sutta are so long and detailed that poor Sigala would have had to say, well, hang on a sec, I'll just nip back to Rajagaha for a notebook to write this down, because there's no way he was ever going to remember it all. If we look at the whole lot, this isn't the sort of thing that the Buddha would have said to Sigala, not the whole entirety. But luckily, it's really easy to pick the wheat from the chaff. It's really easy to see the gist of what the Buddha said, buried under quite a lot of the monkish editions that are put in before it. And the gist of what the Buddha said was, bowing to the 6 directions in this way, Sigala, is not the best way to express your respect and reverence for the world around us, and nor is it going to give you any real protection. What you should do, Sigala, is you should think of your parents as the East, and you should express your respect and gratitude to them. You should think of your teachers as the South, and you should express your respect and gratitude to them. You should think of your wife as the West, and you should express your respect and gratitude to her. You should think of your friends as the North, and you should express your respect and gratitude for them. And you should think of your servants and your employees as the ground beneath your feet, and you should express your respect and gratitude for them. And finally, you should think of spiritual practitioners and spiritual teachers as the sky above your head, and you should express your respect and gratitude to them. And the Buddha goes on to say, and the way to express your gratitude and your respect for these people needs to involve a bit more than just a symbolic act of bowing. You need to express your respect and gratitude by your attitude to all these people, your attitude to your relationship with them, and by the way you treat them. That's how you really express your respect and gratitude. So you need to treat all these different classes of people in all these different relationships with you in a way that's kind, loving, and appropriate to that relationship. So the Buddha gives a whole list of different ways gives a short list of the different ways you should treat each of these people, each of these groups of people. So, for example, you should support your parents in old age. That's just 1 out of 5. You should address your teachers with respect and pay close attention to what they teach. You should be generous to your friends. You should treat your employees and servants as equals, and so on. So the Buddha gives a short list of the ways you should show respect and gratitude in each of these relationships. And then the Buddha goes on to say, and, Sigala, if you show respect and gratitude to all these different sorts of people in all these different ways, then they will show their respect and gratitude and indeed love for you. And then you really will be protected, Sigala. You really will be protected because you will be surrounded by a web of relationships that will support and protect you. So Sigala here, reality is telling Sigala, you are totally dependent on other people. You do not live as an independent being. You are interdependent with others. He is being brought to face to face with the fact that he's not an isolated individual. He owes everything he has, every benefit he has ever received, indeed his very existence and continuation of his existence to other people. He exists within this web of relationships, and the way to protect his existence is to strengthen and protect and nurture these relationships. And of course, the sort of prime way, the way that sums it all up, in the way he should do that is that he should practice kindness, generosity, and honesty within those relationships. He should practice the precepts. So we could say that reality in the shape of the Buddha is telling Sigala about the truth of what Buddhists call Atman. He's telling it to him in a very practical, down-to-earth way that Sigala can relate to. Anatman, the teaching of what's often called, rather misleadingly, non-self. So we all know about the Buddhist teaching of Anatman, or non-self. We talk about it on our introductory courses as one of the 3 lakshanas, along with the inability of transient worldly things to give us permanent satisfaction, the fact of impermanence or transience, and finally Anatman, or non-self. So we could say that the truth of impermanence tells us that all things change, but then the truth of non-self goes on to say there are no things, there is only change. The world is a vast process of continual interconnected sub-processes which just go on and on and on, in which everything is interacting with everything else, everything affects everything else, things are continually changing into other things. And according to this vision of existence, we could say the world is more like a constantly changing river than it is like a collection of static, stable things. So if we look closely, I don't know if you ever look closely at a river, especially a river in flood, And you'll see that there are lots of different sort of entities that appear in this river and continue for a while and change and then merge back into the river. So you get eddies and whirlpools and various patterns of current which have a sort of entity of their own. They have a sort of existence. They have a sort of self. They continue for a while. They've got their own characteristics, but they're not permanent. And you can't possibly say they're in any way separate from all the other eddies and whirlpools around them or from the water of the river itself. You can't cut an eddy out of a river and sort of have it as a separate thing and say, this thing exists in its own right. You can't do that. And the truth of our Atman tells us that we're like that too. We exist rather in the way that an eddy in a stream exists. You can't cut us out from the world and expect us to have some sort of existence independent of that world. We do have our own characteristics, and they're stable for a while. There are big eddies and small eddies, there are, etc., etc. We've got our own characteristics, but we're constantly changing. And we can't really be separated from the world around us. We're constantly affected by, and even kept in existence by what surrounds us. Other people, our society, the environment, the services we depend upon, the ecosystem of the planet. So that's the teaching around that man. And I think what Sigala is being brought to face with here is the practical side of Anatman, which is interrelatedness and interdependence. Now, I'd just like to add a couple of things about this teaching of Anatman, because it's possible to misinterpret this teaching of Anatman in at least two negative ways, which can be totally disastrous. So, the first way we can misinterpret it is to think that the teaching of Anatman tells us we don't have a self. Well, surely that's what it does teach us. It says non-self. No. Actually, Anatman means a permanent, unchanging self. A permanent, unchanging soul. We do have a self. But we don't have an unchanging self, which is independent of the world around us and the people around us. We have a self, but it is always changing, and it is interrelated and interdependent. So that's one misinterpretation, to think we don't have a self. And the second misinterpretation is to think that because we're not independent, we're just pushed around by the world. We can't make our own choices. And if you put those two together, you can get a really disastrous teaching, which is that we have no free will, we can't make choices, we're just pushed around by the world around us. And what does it matter anyway, because we don't have a self? We do have a self, and we must make choices. We need to work with the law of karma to make positive, ethical choices to build a strong, healthy self, which can be a positive part of this web of interrelatedness. That's what the Dharma is about. So actually the teaching of Anatman is very positive, because the other side of non-self is interrelatedness. We do exist. We have a self as we don't exist as independent beings, but we do exist in a way which is intimately related to other people and the world around us. And that is much more fun than being a static, stuck, lonely, separate individual surrounded by a hostile world. And of course, this is what the Buddha is pointing out to Sigala in a way that makes sense to him, living the life he leads. And it brings across what Sigala needs to do about it, the alteration Sigala needs to make in his map of how he's living. You don't exist, Sigala, as an independent entity. You exist as part of this web of relationships, and you need to protect those relationships if you want any sort of safety or happiness in life. That's what reality is telling Sigala, and that's what we need. That's the message. It's a message we need to take from reality as well. So how can we go about doing that in a sort of practical way that makes a difference? How can we become more aware of the reality of interrelatedness, and how can we express this more in the way we live and act, so that our lives are more aligned with the way reality is, and so that we do protect and build this network, this web of relationships that we depend on. Those are the two parts of the teaching to Sigala. So firstly, how can we become more aware of interrelatedness? Well, one really practical way of doing this, which relates directly to the teaching to Sigala, is to do an exercise that we always do on our intermediate course, which some of you might remember. And in this exercise, we write down, we spend 10-15 minutes writing down everyone we can think of who has ever benefited us in any way. So we might start with our parents and think, well, I really didn't get on with my mum, but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. We start with maybe that, and we move forward thinking of teachers, school friends, people who've had a positive influence on us, people who've helped us in any number of ways. Maybe people who've written books that really influenced us, whose thinking influenced us, people whose music we've benefited from, whose art we've benefited from, people who run the services that maybe saved our life, the health service, or keep us in existence. And what we find, of course, when we do this, is if we really think deeply about it, we could carry on forever. We run out of steam earlier than forever because we're human and our brains pack up and we sort of think, oh, that's enough. Yeah, so we call this among ourselves the gratitude exercise. We call it the gratitude exercise, but although we call it the gratitude exercise, we make the point that in a way it's not really fundamentally about gratitude. We can't force ourselves to feel gratitude. Can't write down, my mum gave birth to me and suckled me and did this and that. I feel really grateful to her. Actually, I feel really grumpy about it. But we can recognise benefits received. And the Sanskrit word that often gets translated as benefit received, as gratitude rather, actually means recognition of benefits received. And when we think deeply about it, at all deeply about it, when we think about our life and the people who have affected us and helped us, we simply just have to admit, if we're being honest, that we owe our very existence and all the benefits we've received to others. So doing this exercise is a really excellent way of having our own encounter with reality, with the reality of Anatman and our dependency on the web of relationships that we're part of. And I think it would be a very good idea to do this exercise quite regularly, actually. We could do it several times thinking back about our whole life, because we think of different people every time we do it. And we could revisit it. Yeah, so we could revisit it from time to time, and we could also do it for shorter periods. It might be quite a good practice to think, well, every week I'm just going to sit down and think of the people who have benefited me this week. This will keep us in touch with reality. So if we do that, we'll begin to see much more clearly than we usually do just how dependent we are on others. We start to see, as Sigala did when the Buddha opened his eyes, that we are held in existence by a vast web of relationships. And that we should think of these relationships, this web of relationships, as precious, beyond price. This web is far more important and precious to us than the World Wide Web. This is the universe wide web. Without this, we're goners. So for our own sake, we need to strengthen this web, nurture and cultivate it. In the Sigala Sutta, the Buddha gives Sigala lots of advice about how to do this, but all this advice can be boiled down to the precepts, especially practice kindness, generosity and honesty in your relationships. Talk to people kindly. Do kindly acts for people. Be generous and tell the truth. One thing that will really kill relationships is dishonesty. So if we do the opposite, unkindness, stinginess, dishonesty, they will erode relationships. They'll erode the web like pouring acid on it. And if we're not careful, if we do those things, we could end up with no protective web, alone and unprotected. So we need to practice the precepts within our relationship, especially practice kindness and generosity. But we all know from the Eightfold Path that to change our behaviour, we need to really change our behaviour. We need to work on our emotions. So we need to feel metta for others, not just sort of go through the motions. If we feel metta, we'll naturally practice metta. And then people will respond to our metta with metta, and we will be protected. So doing the metta bhavana for others is one of the best ways we can protect and benefit ourselves. And of course, if we do the gratitude exercise, if we recognise benefits received, that will tend to turn into the emotion of gratitude. A heartfelt desire to benefit others as we have been benefited. And that is transformative. So instead of asking, what can I get from this relationship, or what can I get from this community or this web of relationships, we ask ourselves, what can I contribute? What can I contribute to this relationship? Or what can I contribute to this community of relationships? And again, by the perverse alchemy of the spiritual life, this change in focus from ourselves to others is the best way we can benefit ourselves. Because it strengthens the web of support and protection that we are completely dependent upon. So to end this talk, I'd like to just draw out a couple of other points that the Buddha talks about in the sutta. So the Buddha talked about a very, very rich network of relationships in his sutta, such as tend to exist in traditional societies, like the one he lived in. So in that sort of society, relationships between teacher and pupil were really, really important, really strong and important. Relationships between friends were regarded as absolutely vital, really important to any sort of decent life. Relationships even between employer and employee were personal relationships and very important. But in our society, this web of relationships has been eroded, it's been pruned rather drastically. So that for many people, the only close relationships remaining are within the nuclear family, the sexual partner and the children. Very, very small. Hardly a web at all here, just a sort of few strands. Other relationships, like friendship, the relationship of friends in particular, has been very, very downvalued. And other relationships have become, if you like, depersonalised, professionalised. So instead of talking to a good friend about our problems, for example, we pay a counsellor to do what a friend would once have done. So I think it's a really important part of what we need to do is to regenerate this rich web of friendships. The Buddha talks particularly about friendship. One of the things he really draws out in the sutta is friendship. And he says, well, okay, how do you develop friendships? I think Sangha had something really useful to say about that. He said, if you want a friend, you have to be a friend. You can't have a friendship by expecting somebody to do things to you. You start, it's unilateral. You just go out and you benefit this other person. So, but what the Buddha talks about is a list. Hey, it's a Buddhist list called the 4 Samgrahavastis. He said, this is how you have friendships. You have friendships through generosity. You develop a friendship through generosity, through kindly speech, through helpful action, and finally through what we could translate, what the sutta I was reading translated as I can't, anyway, it's to do with treating the other as yourself. It's basically to do with treating the other as yourself and treating your friends equally. So that's the Buddha's recipe for friendship. Generosity, kindly speech, helpful activity, and treating others as you would like to be treated. So And I think that's really important, because one of the things that I think is a real insight of Sangha Actions, the founder of our order, is the need to really re-evaluate, re-emphasize the importance of friendship in our society. And moving on from that, to re-emphasize the importance of community, particularly community with a spiritual basis, positive community with a spiritual basis. Because these Samgravastas, this list, the ways of building a community, the ways of building friendship, the ways of building a community, it's both. It's both the ways of building friendship and the ways of building a community. Those four things are they're part of the theory of the way we try to run this Buddhist centre, which is why we have things like a Dharma economy. You build a friendship, and wider than that, you build a community on the basis of generosity, not on the basis of I'll give you this if you give me that. You build a community and a friendship on the basis of speaking kindly to each other, trying to bring out what's best in each other, beneficial activity towards each other, and not sort of forming little factions, treating others equally, treating others as yourself. I think this is really important that we take this on board. We take on board this idea that we need to we need to regrow this web of relationships. The nuclear family is going to leave us, if that's the sum total of our really close relationships, we're going to be pretty unprotected. That falls apart pretty easily. We can just end up on our own. We need to build communities where there's a much wider range of close personal relationships of all different sorts. All the different sorts maybe that exist in the Sigala Sutta. So I think we need to take these Samgravastas in our relationship with other people really seriously and apply them to building a community here. It strikes me that, we're often told we live in a world with massive problems of anxiety and depression and various forms of mental illness. And a lot of that is down to the absence of real positive communities. People are hungry for positive communities. We can do the world, even without getting enlightened, we can do the world a terrific favour by just developing a positive community among ourselves. That's a bit of an example. But further than that, we need to develop that positive community if we want to be enlightened. So I think we need to build and be part of a community in which people serve each other in a personal rather than professional way. We're all serving each other. A community of generosity in which we all give our various gifts and receive the benefits of other people's various gifts. That's what we're trying to create here. And only if we do that will any of us, make real spiritual progress, because of the reality of anatman, the reality of non-self, the reality of interdependency and interrelatedness implies that we can't do it on our own. We need to create a web of relationships in which we can thrive and grow. And that's the only way that we're going to get anywhere. So it'd be really good if we did it.